The CEO's daughter fell for the dishwasher. It started so quietly, almost invisibly, like the soft hum of the restaurant lights after closing time. Amara Benton, the only daughter of powerful CEO Charles Benton, had grown up surrounded by wealth, comfort, and expectations. Her life was carefully polished, just like the silver cutlery that sparkled under the silver swan chandeliers. She was known for her grace, beauty, and a kindness that felt out of place in the cold, competitive world her father ruled. Every day she visited the Silver Swan, her father's most prestigious restaurant, to observe its operations as part of her business training. But soon her attention wasn't on the guests or the managers. It was on the quiet man who worked in the back, washing dishes without ever looking up. His name was Malik. No one knew his full name and no one dared to ask. He was different from the rest of the staff. He worked with a calm, focused rhythm, never complaining, never gossiping. There was something about the way he carried himself, humble, yet with an odd sort of quiet dignity that caught Amara's eye. While others laughed or hurried through their duties, Malik stayed in the shadows, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes down. Yet whenever he passed by, Amara felt a strange sense of peace. She noticed the small things, the way he stacked dishes perfectly, the care he took with every glass, the soft hum of a tune under his breath. At first, she didn't understand why she kept watching him. She told herself it was curiosity. Just curiosity about a man who seemed so out of place in her father's world. But soon she began finding reasons to walk through the kitchen. A misplaced file here, a taste test there, anything to catch a glimpse of him. The other workers noticed, of course. Whispers started to move through the kitchen like steam over boiling pots. The boss's daughter likes the dishwasher. Some laughed quietly. Others looked uneasy, afraid what would happen if Charles Benton found out. But Amara didn't care. The more she watched Malik, the more drawn she felt to him. She saw in him a piece she had never known, something real, unshaped by wealth or privilege. One evening, she stayed late, helping the staff after a busy event. She saw Malik still working, his hands moving rhythmically through the soapy water. The sight filled her with an ache she couldn't explain. She wanted to know who he was. She wanted to understand why a man who carried himself like a leader would choose to be a dishwasher. From that night, she began to notice more. The quiet confidence in his movements. The small moments when his eyes lingered on the restaurant's art, as if he recognized the artist. The way he seemed to understand the flow of the kitchen better than even the head chef. It was as if he had lived another life before this one, a life far removed from dishwater and rubber gloves. But Amara didn't ask, not yet. What she didn't know was that Malik had noticed her too, and though he never showed it, her presence stirred something deep inside him, something he had buried long ago. As days passed, their unspoken connection grew stronger. Yet behind that calm face, Malik carried a secret, one that could shatter everything. Amara thought she knew about him, and about her own family, and soon that secret would no longer stay hidden. Malik came to the Silver Swan months ago with nothing but a backpack and a quiet request for work. The manager had taken pity on him, giving him the lowest position available. No résumé? No references. Just a man who looked like he'd already been through too much. Yet behind his quiet eyes was a storm. Once Malik had worn suits instead of aprons. Once he had been a name whispered in corporate meetings, a rising star in the business world. But betrayal, greed, and tragedy had burned that life down. He had lost everything, his fortune, his name, his trust in people. Working as a dishwasher wasn't survival, it was hiding. He wanted peace, anonymity. But now, Amara's gaze had begun to chip away at the walls he'd built. Every time she smiled at him, he felt the weight of the truth pressing harder against his chest. He shouldn't have cared. She was the daughter of the man whose company had destroyed him. Yes, Charles Benton, her father, was the man responsible for Malik's fall. Years ago, Malik had been Charles's business partner, a young, ambitious entrepreneur with ideas that could have changed industries. But when Malik's company started to rise too fast, Charles betrayed him, stealing his innovation and leaving him to take the blame for fraud. Malik lost everything: his career, his family's trust, his reputation. And now, years later, fate had brought him to the very doorstep of the man who had ruined his life. Yet instead of revenge, Malik found himself trapped between two conflicting emotions: hatred for the father and an unexplainable affection for the daughter. Each night he told himself to leave, to walk away before the truth came out. But something about Amara's innocence, her genuine kindness, kept him rooted there. She wasn't like her father. Her laughter was gentle, her curiosity sincere, and in her presence, Malik began to remember the man he used to be, the man before the bitterness. But secrets have a way of surfacing. One evening, after closing, Malik accidentally left his locker unlocked. Amara, searching for a towel, opened it, and inside, she found a single, neatly folded photograph. It showed Malik in a suit, standing beside her father at a corporate event years ago. The realization struck her like thunder. Who was this man? And why had he never told anyone who he really was? The photograph trembled in Amara's hands. It was old, the edges curling slightly, but the image was unmistakable. Her father, Charles Benton, stood proudly beside Malik, both in sleek suits, both smiling before a banner that read, Benton and Reed Innovations Launch Day. Her pulse quickened. Benton and Reed. She had heard that name once before, buried in the stories of her father's early business ventures and the company he built his empire on. But she had never known who Reed was. Her father had only ever said that his first partner didn't last. And now she was staring at that man's face. Amara's mind swirled. Malik, the dishwasher she had secretly admired, wasn't just a worker. He was someone who had once stood at her father's side, someone who had clearly been erased from her father's story. Her stomach twisted as she remembered her father's lessons about trust and betrayal, about cutting ties with people who couldn't keep up. What if Malik had been one of those people? What if he had wronged her father? Or, worse, what if her father had wronged him? That thought she couldn't shake. For the next few days, she said nothing. But she watched. Every movement Malik made, every silence he held, carried new meaning. He wasn't just a man washing dishes. He was a man hiding from something, or perhaps hiding for something. The staff had noticed her quiet mood. Whispers filled the kitchen again. Some said she'd lost interest in the dishwasher. Others said she had finally realized who he was. But no one dared ask her directly. Then, one evening, Amara made a decision. She stayed behind after closing time, waiting near the kitchen door until everyone had left. The restaurant was silent, the hum of the refrigerators echoing like a heartbeat. Malik was the last to leave. He turned off the faucet, wiped his hands, and looked up, only to find Amara standing there, holding the photo. Her eyes said everything. Malik froze. For a moment, his usually calm composure cracked, and a flicker of something, regret. Perhaps pain had flashed across his face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. Amara's mind raced, filled with questions she couldn't ask aloud. Who was he really? Why was he here scrubbing dishes in her father's restaurant? And why had he never told her? She handed him the photo quietly, watching his hands tremble as he took it. His gaze softened, distant, as if he were staring back into a life long lost. Then, gently, he placed the photo back into his pocket and walked past her. That night, Amara couldn't stop thinking. Malik had looked like a man haunted by truth, and she couldn't rest until she knew what that truth was. The next morning, she confronted her father. She mentioned Malik's name casually at first, to gauge his reaction. Charles Benton's expression shifted instantly. His smile faltered. The air grew cold. "Malik Reed," she said again, watching the color drain from his face. Her father stood up from his desk, trying to appear calm, but his voice carried tension. He dismissed her questions, saying the man was a mistake from the past, someone who had betrayed his trust. But the way he said it, too sharp, too defensive, told Amara there was more. After that conversation, she knew. She didn't know the full story yet, but she knew one thing. Her father wasn't telling the truth. Days passed. The distance between Amara and her father grew, while her curiosity about Malik deepened. One night, as the rain poured outside, she returned to the restaurant again. She found Malik sitting alone near the dish station, his apron folded neatly beside him, his eyes lost in thought. And for the first time, she saw the weight he carried, the exhaustion not just of a day's work, but of years, of loss, injustice, and silence. She wanted to ask. She wanted to demand the truth. but something in his eyes told her not to. So instead, she simply sat across from him quietly, both of them listening to the rain. In that silence, she began to understand. This man wasn't broken. He was waiting. For what, she didn't know. But she could feel the storm coming. A few days later, that storm arrived. It started when her father decided to host a private investor dinner at the Silver Swan. The restaurant buzzed with energy. The city's elite filled the hall, and every member of staff was on edge. Malik was assigned to the back again, cleaning up after the main course. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Halfway through the dinner, a major investor asked about the history of Benton Enterprises. Charles Benton began his usual speech, polished, rehearsed, self-glorifying, about how he built everything from the ground up. And then, one man in the audience interrupted him. A tall, older gentleman stood and asked a single question that froze the entire room. "Wasn't your first company founded with someone named Malik Reed?" The name hit the room like lightning. Charles faltered. The crowd turned. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from the kitchen doorway, Malik stepped out, wiping his hands, his expression calm, but his presence powerful enough to silence everyone. Every head turned. Every whisper stopped. The dishwasher had walked into the center of the dining hall. And as he stood there, under the same chandeliers that once lit his downfall, everyone could see it now, the quiet authority in his posture, the intelligence in his gaze. Amara's heart pounded. Her father's face turned pale. Malik didn't need to say a word. His very presence was the truth they had all been missing. The CEO's daughter had fallen for the dishwasher. But now, she finally knew who he really was. The man her father had erased. The man who had once built the empire her family lived on. The man who had returned not for revenge, but for closure. And as he looked at Charles Benton one last time, the truth settled over everyone. Like a final curtain drop, the dishwasher wasn't beneath anyone. He was the foundation on which everything stood. The moment Malik stepped into the dining hall, the world seemed to stop breathing. The chandeliers glittered above him, the golden light reflecting off the polished tables. Yet all eyes were fixed on the man who had just emerged. From the kitchen, the man in a dishwasher's uniform who suddenly carried the presence of a king. Charles Benton, the powerful CEO who commanded entire boardrooms with his voice, stood frozen. His investors stared at him, their curiosity sharpening into suspicion. For a long, heavy silence, no one spoke. Then Malik placed the towel he carried on a nearby table, a small, quiet act, but one that felt like closing a book he'd carried too long. The man who had once been invisible was now undeniable. Amara sat near the front, her heart racing as truth unfolded before her eyes. She could see it all now, not as a daughter watching her father's pride, but as a woman watching a man reclaim what was stolen from him. Years of silence broke without a word. Malik didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the man who had once been his partner, his friend, his betrayer. The investors began murmuring. Someone whispered Malik's name, Malik Reed, the co-founder of Benton and Reed Innovations, the man who had disappeared years ago, under mysterious accusations of fraud and embezzlement, the man whose downfall had never quite made sense. Now he stood before them, alive, calm, and quietly powerful. Charles Benton tried to speak, but his words faltered. His voice cracked as he attempted to control the narrative, saying Malik had come back to cause trouble, that this was an attempt at manipulation. But the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. Malik remained still. He didn't need to defend himself. The truth was already speaking louder than any denial. Finally, one of the older investors, a man who had been with Benton since the early days, rose from his seat. He looked between the two men, his voice trembling. He spoke about the past, about how Malik had been the creative force behind the company's earliest success, how the sudden accusations against him had always felt staged. He remembered the night Malik vanished, the rumors that followed, and the way Charles Benton's empire grew immediately after. And now, standing before them, the missing piece had returned. Charles Benton's face turned pale. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. The whispers became questions. Questions became confrontations. The investors demanded answers, about the fraud, the stolen ideas, the lies buried beneath years of profit and prestige. But the man who had once commanded rooms with his confidence now struggled to form coherent words. His empire, his image, his entire identity. All of it began to crumble in the eyes of the people who once revered him. And through it all, Malik stayed silent. His silence was louder than anger, heavier than revenge. It was the silence of a man who no longer needed to prove himself. Amara felt her heart breaking. The truth had shattered the illusions she had lived under all her life. Her father, the man she had idolized, had built his kingdom on someone else's ruin, and the man she had quietly fallen for, the man her father would have dismissed as nothing, had been the true architect all along. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched Malik turn away, heading back toward the kitchen. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He didn't care for applause or vengeance. He only wanted to leave the truth where it belonged, out in the open. But Charles Benton couldn't let him walk away. Years of pride and ego wouldn't allow it. He followed Malik toward the back, his voice rising, echoing across the restaurant as anger overtook fear. He accused Malik of betrayal, of jealousy, of trying to destroy him again. Yet the words bounced off empty air. Because everyone in that room had seen the truth in Malik's eyes. Not hatred, not envy, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only after a man stops running from his past. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with silence. Malik stood at the threshold of the kitchen, turned once more and looked at Amara. His eyes softened. There was no triumph there, no pride. Only sorrow, for the pain this truth had caused her. Then he walked out into the rain. That night the Silver Swan emptied slowly. The investors left in whispers. Charles Benton retreated to his office, his world collapsing behind closed doors. And Amara sat alone in the dining hall long after everyone had gone, staring at the door Malik had disappeared through. She understood now why he had been quiet all along, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. He had known the truth would surface when it was meant to. The rain fell harder outside, echoing the storm inside her. She knew that nothing would ever be the same. Her father's empire would face questions, investigations, maybe even downfall. But all she could think about was the man who had walked away. The man who had carried his truth with grace, even after losing everything. Amara knew she couldn't let the story end there. She stood, grabbed her coat, and ran into the night, the rain soaking her hair, her heart pounding with both guilt and determination. She didn't know where Malik had gone, but she knew she had to find him. Not as the CEO's daughter, not as someone seeking answers, but as someone who finally saw him for who he really was. The storm roared around her, but she didn't stop. Because sometimes love doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in truth, even when that truth breaks everything first. And somewhere, in the shadows of the city, Malik Reed walked alone, unaware that the woman whose world had just shattered was following the path he'd taken. The city was drenched in rain that night. Streetlights flickered, cars hissed along wet roads, and the world seemed to move in slow motion, like even time had paused to let the story finish what it started. Amara ran through the empty streets, her coat clinging to her as the rain poured harder. The echo of Malik's footsteps had long faded, but she followed instinct more than reason. The same instinct that had first drawn her eyes to him weeks ago, when he was just the quiet dishwasher in the back of the restaurant. Now she knew better. He wasn't just a man who washed dishes. He was a man who had once built empires and lost them to greed. A man who had been betrayed, erased, and yet carried himself with grace instead of vengeance. And she wasn't chasing a mystery anymore. She was chasing the truth, her truth. She found him eventually, sitting on a bench near the old river bridge, where the city lights shimmered against the water like broken pieces of a dream. Malik sat there drenched, his head bowed, his eyes lost in the reflections. He looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if the storm inside him had finally passed. Amara stood a few steps behind, hesitant at first. She could have turned away. She could have gone back to her world of comfort and silence, but something in her heart wouldn't allow it. She stepped forward slowly until her shadow merged with his. Malik didn't turn, but he knew she was there. He had known she would come. The air between them was filled with unspoken words, apologies, confessions, and realizations too heavy for speech. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man behind the silence, not the victim of her father's greed, not the dishwasher or the co-founder, but the human being who had carried dignity through destruction. And in that moment, she understood what strength truly looked like. Malik had every reason to destroy her father, to expose him, to reclaim everything he'd lost. Yet he hadn't, because somewhere along his journey, revenge had turned into wisdom. He didn't need to ruin anyone. He only needed to live free from lies. The rain softened, turning into a mist. The night quieted like the world was listening. Amara finally spoke, her voice barely above the sound of the water. She didn't ask him why he came back or how he could forgive so much. She only said the one thing that mattered. She believed him. Malik looked up then, and in his eyes she saw years of pain, but also relief. Someone finally saw him, not through gossip or fear, but through truth. They sat in silence after that, watching the city's lights shimmer on the surface of the river. It wasn't romantic in the fairy tale sense. It was raw, real, and human. Two souls, both broken by the same man's pride, finding peace in each other's honesty. Back at the Silver Swan, the fallout had already begun. Word of the confrontation had spread through the business world like wildfire. The press was asking questions, and the investors were demanding answers. Charles Benton's empire, built on deception, began to crack. The board forced him to step down. Investigations opened into his past dealings, and as the truth came to light, the name Malik Reed started to rise again, not as a victim, but as the man who had once built the foundation of the Benton empire. But Malik didn't celebrate. He didn't seek interviews or revenge. He simply walked away from it all. He had found peace, and no empire could match that. Weeks passed. The Silver Swan changed. The staff spoke Malik's name with respect now, not pity. Amara took over daily management in her father's absence, determined to rebuild not just the restaurant's image, but her family's integrity. She didn't see Malik again for a while, but she carried his lessons with her: humility, grace, strength, and silence. The man who had once washed dishes had taught her more about leadership and humanity than her father ever had. Then one morning a letter arrived. No address, no signature, just a single line written in Malik's precise handwriting. Sometimes the truest revenge is simply living well. Below it, a business card. Reed Foundation for Ethical Innovation. Amara smiled through tears. Malik hadn't disappeared. He had rebuilt quietly, as always. Not in the shadows of revenge, but in the light of redemption. Months later, at a charity gala for young entrepreneurs, Amara saw him again. He stood across the room, surrounded by people who admired him, yet still carrying that same calm air she had first noticed. When their eyes met, no words were needed. The world had seen a scandal. Her father had seen a rival. But Amara, she had seen the truth. She had fallen for the dishwasher. And in the end, she discovered he was never beneath her world. He had only chosen to rise above it. Malik Reed walked toward her, and the crowd around them faded. There was no bitterness between them, only mutual respect, and something deeper, something that didn't need a label. As they stood together, a quiet understanding passed between them. Life had tested them both, broken illusions and burned away everything false. What remained was real, something rare, something earned. The night glittered like the start of something new, and for the first time in years, Malik smiled, not because he had won, but because he was finally free.